Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Popcorn and Compliance, a podcast where, with Jay Rosen, we take a look at movies from the compliance perspective. But before we get to our podcast, have you ever thought about starting your own podcast? Would you like to explore some compliance topic? Well, I have founded the Compliance Podcast Network, and I'm looking for new podcasters. If you've wondered how you might start a podcast, please listen to our sponsor, One Stone Creative.
If you're enjoying this show, you might enjoy hosting your own. As an expert in your field, you have skills, knowledge, and insight that can help you expand your practice, meet new people, and create amazing content to share with the world. In as little as 2 hours a week, you can dramatically change how you promote, fill, and position your business. And One Stone Creative can show you how. Learn more at onestonecreative.net.
In this podcast, Jay and I take a look at the recently released Captain Marvel. In spite of the fact that many online trolls attempted to destroy the reputation of the movie before it came out because of its alleged feminist message, it's been a huge hit. So we take a look at online trolling, what you can do to protect yourself, and of course, lessons from the compliance perspective. Popcorn and Compliance is an offering of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, the Compliance Evangelist, back with Jay Rosen, Mr. Monitors, for another episode of Popcorn and Compliance, the podcast where we take a look at movies and see what compliance lessons we may draw from them. Today, you're in for a real treat because we have the recently released Captain Marvel. First of all, Jay, welcome.
Thanks, Tom. Always good to be here to talk popcorn and compliance with you. And as you said, we're both really excited about Captain Marvel. It premiered last Thursday, March 8th, which in a stroke of marketing genius from the Walt Disney Company happened to be International Women's Day. So to come up with a female-led comic book hero and release it then made a lot of smart business sense for them. Just to give you a little bit of the inside Hollywood and internet dirt, there was a potential snag in the plan of the release of the movie because there were fanboy trolls who were going both on Rotten Tomatoes and YouTube and just going ahead and bashing the movie and referring to it as an SJW nonsense, social justice warrior. The star of the movie, Brie Larson, has been pretty outspoken about diversity in terms of the people making the movies and also the people reviewing the movies. So there's a couple articles that I found where, unfortunately, it seems like these fanboy white males feel threatened in the Marvel character universe, that bringing in a strong woman like Captain Marvel could upset their position in the galaxy, which I just find absolutely absurd. But we've got so many people who are worried about global change and what's happening in our country that their position may longer be there. And I just want to assure all the white male fanboys out there that you will still have a place in the Marvel universe. The problem is that it might just be led by Captain Marvel. So the movie opened last week very well and is looking like it is going to come in anywhere on the low end between 750 and 775 million, and it might top $1 billion, and it would be one of the more successful origin stories from the Marvel character universe. So that's my little spiel on what's happening with the internet, the reaction to the movie. Tom, do you want to go into a brief synopsis before we start talking about the ethics and compliance lessons we can draw from it?
So actually, Jay, I'd like to pick up on that point and go a little bit into the weeds, particularly around Rotten Tomatoes, because that is a source I think that many people look to determine kind of the thumbs up or thumbs down on the film. And prior to the upcoming release, or prior to I think in January and February, there was a 79% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes. But just as the film was about to release, that rating approval had literally dropped to 28%. And So Rotten Tomatoes took a look into what was going on and really determined that the people were doing just what you said, which was trolling. And so they changed the way that they looked at and recorded what people were inputting into the site. And by doing so, they were able to remove those internet trolls that you articulated are certainly afraid of the feminist nature of the movie, feminist nature of the lead actress, and a non-white male leading a Marvel movie. But I thought it was interesting that Rotten Tomatoes actually made a technological response to note that these people had commented, yet were able to take out the online trolling portion and show that the movie had a positive review. The pre-reviews of the movie were most generally positive, from literally A.O. Scott of the New York Times, Keith Turin writing in the Los Angeles Times. There were some middling reviews, but you kind of get those on pretty much every movie. It's just a lot of fun. And when you have a movie that's just a lot of fun, that is well produced, you're going to tend to get generally positive reviews because it's, hey, it's a comic book movie, guys. There's really not much more to that. But a great point, and I guess I'm going to tie this in at the end for a lesson learned for the compliance practitioner, but I'm glad you started off with this because I think it's an important point that we need to consider and corporations need to consider as well. So,
yeah, there's a little thing called plot that sometimes these comic book movies actually do a pretty good job of. So I wanted to see your takeaways from the plot, and then we'll go into compliance lessons.
So it starts off on the Kree home planet of Hala, and Yanrog Vers is the title character played by Brie Larson. She has memory issues, and she's learning to become sort of a SAS, Green Beret, Navy SEAL type strike force member, working for the supreme intelligence and artificial intelligence that rules the Kree. And she's working very hard, both on her physical skills, but also her mental skills to keep her emotions in check. During a rescue mission to rescue an undercover operative of the Kree against their archenemies, the Skrulls, who are shapeshifters, Vers is captured and taken aboard their vessel for torture. She manages to escape, crash lands in Los Angeles, in one of the most spectacular kind of scenes, really from an egg and Hollywood Insider perspective that we'll go into in a little bit later. She gets to an Air Force base looking for Dr. Wendy Larson, who she recognized from her nightmares. She gets hooked up with her former best friend, who is a woman named Carol Danvers, a retired pilot, Air Force pilot who lives in Louisiana. And they get with Nick Fury. For those who are from the Marvel Universe will certainly remember and recognize his name. And then they head back out to a super secret Air Force base in California, where she flew and indeed had crashed, which most people thought she died. In this, returning to the crash site, she gets her memory back. She has some couple of other adventures, and turns out the Kree are the bad guys and the Skrulls are the good guys. She helps the Kree escape, prevents massacre of more Krees, and in a great, not twist at the end, but foreshadowing at the end. If you'll recall, at the end of Avengers 1 Endgame, Nick Fury turned to dust while he hit some control panel he was holding. And that control panel was a 1990s era pager that sent a page to Danvers, Captain Marvel. And so at the end of the teaser plot, foreshadowing, she returns to Earth as well. So that's just a kind of a very rough summary. You want to talk about some of the brilliant eggs that were planted in this or other things that caught your eye?
Yeah, well, first of all, I just love that when she arrives in Los Angeles in 1990. And the way I read it was a heavy tip of the cap to James Cameron and the beginning of the first Terminator movie where Arnold shows up naked in a ball. And then after that, the guy who's trying to take down the Terminator shows up. So I think there's a tip of the cap there. Some other things I picked up, as you noted initially, when they refer to Captain Marvel, they call her Vers, V-E-R-S. And what we see later on is when we look at her dog tags, her name was Danvers, so we know who she is. And when Nick Fury is getting ready to write up the protocol for a team of superheroes who will be able to fight and defend America and the world, he notices that her nickname on the dog tag is Avenger. So we get a lot of information there, and this reminds me, I think you'll appreciate this because you are a Star Trek aficionado. If you recall, in the first Star Trek movie, they called the sentient life force out there, they called it V'ger. And the reason they called it V'ger was because it was really a Voyager satellite that was sent out there, but the OYA had faded out. So I think Vers reminded me of what they did with V'ger in Star Trek. So lots of great 1990 song. I think there was like a Joan Jett song in there. And she's just, it's really great to see the gusto with which she kicks ass. And, Brie Larson is a pretty serious actor. And you can see that, some of the people who are really successful in the Marvel character universe, somebody like Robert Downey Jr. playing Iron Man, you wouldn't initially think that those very serious actors would do well in a popcorn kind of movie. But I think they really bring gravitas to the role and they make it believable and make it very watchable. So those are my Easter eggs. Did you have any that you wanted to touch on, Tom?
Yeah, I'm going to go even geekier here, which is she crash lands on Earth. She lands in a blockbuster. So that's an homage to an entire generation. But
I
even
had to
better,
explain that to Millie and Michaela because they had no idea what a blockbuster was.
right. So but when she stands up after having crash landed, she sees the cutout for the Cameron movie True Lies. And she thinks that is a enemy soldier, so she blasts it to smithereens. And so that's yet another homage to Cameron. And interestingly enough, True Lies is the one of two Cameron movies that's never been converted or upgraded to digital, and it's generally viewed as not one of his top ones. So even greater homage. Shall we get to the Top Gun references? And
Sure.
I thought just a beautiful homage. There's a cat running throughout this movie that has quite an important role, and his name is Goose. So my wife and I were punching each other when we showed that. But probably my favorite was the Poncho's Bar reference. I don't know if anybody in here knows who Poncho was or what Poncho's Bar was. Well, Poncho was a real person, and she was a very gruff woman who ran the only bar outside the Miramar Secret Air Force Base in the 50s. So all the pilots drank there. And if you've read Chuck Yeager's book or you read All the Right Stuff, which had a fair amount about Chuck Yeager, you know who Poncho is. So the original reference to Poncho's Bar, I just absolutely loved that as well. These kind of references are sprinkled throughout the movie. The call signs, clearly a nod towards Top Gun as well. And really just a lot of fun for that reason for me.
And one other real nice touch was if you're a fan of the MCU, you notice that they usually start with a little, I guess, teaser into the movie, and then what happens is you see the Marvel logo, and as the letters come out, you see different heroes. And what was really lovely with this is they had multiple scenes with Stan Lee, who we all know has recently passed away, and they really gave Stan his due for what he did to create the Marvel Universe. So I think that was really touching. I know a lot of people who almost shed a couple tears on that one. I'd like to jump in, Tom, on 3 of the ethics and compliance takeaways that I'd like to go with. And first of all, when you recapsulated the movie, you talked about how Danvers was kind of confused and she didn't know who she was, and she went back in down earth to kind of get her bearings and figure out what was happening. And as we see in the movie, there is this fight between the 2 different civilizations, the Skrulls and the Krees, and what Danvers had to do was get out of her own mind and go out into the world and really investigate. So I think my number one takeaway is if you are confused about the story that you're getting and it doesn't make any sense as a compliance officer, that is your cue to get out of the office, to go to the foreign company, to go on the shop floor and to start investigating, because things that you may have been told or what you may believe may not be the actual thing in truth. And I think that's exactly what Danvers discovered when she got out there and she started to realize that the Skrulls were really her allies as opposed to the Krees. And, one other thing I'd like to just really talk about is Ben Mendelsohn, who's often overlooked Australian actor. He played Talos, who is the sympathetic Skrull, and he did a great job. The second thing that you need to do is that you may have to take action to shift balance. And again, she was put in this situation where she had a mentor, she had a whole life that was told to her, and she didn't believe what that was. So by getting out of the office, by getting onto the floor, by doing the research for herself, her own due diligence, she was able to take action to set the universe back into order and to put herself, in the right standing. And the last thing that I really talked about before was this was a classic battle between what she had been known, what she had known, how she grew up, and this battle between her that she's getting pulled between Talos and how do you say his last name? Young Rogue. So anyhow, again, you may have to put yourself in a position where you may not be popular, where you may be a whistleblower, where you may have to take on the status quo. And I think in the trajectory of a hero, which we usually talk about, Joseph Campbell and How We Learn, I thought the filmmakers did a really good job of telling an origin story and putting a character in moral distress and her having to make ethical choices along the way to survive and do the right thing.
Well, it's really interesting, Jay. So here are my 3. And the first one, I think, is just a derivation of your last point, which is you have to understand where you're from and to really know where you're going. And I think in the corporate world, that really means you have to know the business. As a compliance officer, you have to understand how you do business. You talked about getting out of the ivory tower. That's certainly part of it, but it's knowing the processes. I did a training course on investigations yesterday, and I said, as a compliance professional, you have to know the business better than the business guys if you're sitting across the table interviewing them. So you have to understand where you're from, really, to know where you may be going, and then to, if you need to, affect changes or remediate. The second was, and I absolutely love Samuel L. Jackson anyway, but he was just a completely irreverent Nick Fury, as he always is. But he was even more irreverent. But from him, I got, what's your response to new risks? Are you in a business situation that has presented new risks or risks that you haven't even thought of? Because pretty clearly, the risk to Earth brought by the Skrulls and the Kree were not the risks that either S.H.I.E.L.D. was set up to defend against or that they were prepared to defend against. So if a new risk shows up, how are you going to, first of all, find out about it, then how are you going to assess it, and then how you're going to manage it? So new risks. And then let me just kind of, I thought this was worth its own separate point, although it's a subset of the prior point. It's even after you identify the risk, you have to assess your risks. So, and here I would like to use one of my other favorite eggs, which was Goose the cat. And Goose the cat has a pretty important role, as we find out at the very end of the movie. But he also did one other thing. His clawing of Nick Fury led to an eye injury that led to Nick Fury losing his eye. So when you see him in modern day Marvel movies with a patch, he lost that eye not in combat or some other, super secret agent activity, but literally because he was petting a cat and the cat reached out and scratched his eye, and he either let it get infected or somehow it got infected and he lost his eye. So what's the risk in petting a cat? It would appear to be low risk. But if it's sitting that close to your face and it has a very sharp set of claws, perhaps the risk level has increased. So how do you assess your risks? And I thought that was it was a good lesson for me to think about that, Nick Fury losing his eye, because I had never heard that origin story either, Jay. So, some of the roles, I guess we didn't really talk about all of the actors, but a huge shout out to Jude Law for Young Rog, the mentor of Ver's before she turns on him. I thought he did a really great performance. You mentioned Ben Mendelsohn, certainly Samuel L. Jackson as Nick Fury. We got to see Clark Gregg as Phil Coulson. Whether it's a couple of the Iron Man movies, the Avenger movie, and certainly the TV show Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., Clark Gregg has been around, but I thought he had a really interesting role as Phil Coulson, and he did play a fairly critical role presaging his well-known intuition going forward. So really good acting, I thought, in this, particularly for a comic book movie, but a lot of fun, Jay.
Yeah, I think people are going to know where we're going to come with the ratings, and where I live now, we have something called the Studio Movie Grill. So it's one of those kind of upper scale places where you go and they bring you food while you watch the movie. So at the Studio Movie Grill in Simi Valley, if you get a large popcorn, they'll give you the refill at the same time. So I am going to give this movie, Captain Marvel, not one overflowing bucket of popcorn, but two, because I'm going to take the refill right now.
So it's good to know that Studio Movie Grill, which developed or originated in the hinterland of we flyover states, has finally made it to the prestigious West Coast. So I've enjoyed many a movie there. Enjoy going forward. And if you're in a town that has one, I suggest you check it out because it's a great movie experience. Well, that's interesting, Jay. I'm going to have to agree with you on this. With an overflowing bucket of popcorn, because I haven't walked out of that too many movies out of the movie theater lately with a big smile on my face. just because I enjoyed it so much. And I hope our listeners have gotten the sense from listening to me of how much I enjoyed this movie. It was a ton of fun. One other thing I wanted to throw in, you really hit the Stan Lee homage. Great, Jay. But here's the thing that struck me on the Stan Lee scene. They actually changed the music. They changed, she was in an action sequence, and they had sort of heart-pounding, drum-driven, speedy action movie music background going, and they changed it to clearly a much more classical tribute. And I thought that was just a lovely touch. And I certainly noticed it. But the Stan Lee homage was great. You're absolutely right. There were, I think, a lot of people our age we got to say goodbye. And it didn't surprise me to see him in there, but I hadn't anticipated I would get to say goodbye in that way.
Yeah, just really well done. So I guess, as we said, you all know where Tom and I stand on Captain Marvel. We suggest you get out there and see it in a big theater in a widescreen format with lots of sound. And just be assured that, I guess, later next month, Captain Marvel will return, and we will see what happens before, or actually what happens either before or after Nick Fury hits that 1990s pager to make the call for help. So on behalf of Tom Fox, the compliance evangelist, and myself, Mr. Monitor, we'd like to thank you for joining us for Popcorn and Compliance, and today's movie was Captain Marvel.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Popcorn and Compliance, where Jay and I were joined by Lisa Fine, co-founder and co-host of Great Women in Compliance. If you have any questions, you can reach out to Jay at Rosen at affiliatedmonitors.com. You can reach me at tfox at tfoxlaw.com. I hope you'll join us for our next episode of Popcorn and Compliance. Popcorn and Compliance is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.